Imagine a winter so cold that rivers froze solid, crops turned to ice, and entire forests cracked under the frost. Europe was trapped in darkness and snow, and for months survival was a daily battle. Families burned furniture for warmth, bread became a luxury, and villages emptied as people starved or fled. Yet amidst the frozen chaos, the resilience of humanity shone through. Communities fought, adapted, and endured the deadliest winter in history. The Great Frost of 1709 didn't just freeze the land, it reshaped society, economies, and the very way people lived. How did Europe survive one of the harshest winters ever recorded? This is the story of humanity against nature's ultimate test. The coldest winter in history, the Great Frost of 1709. In the winter of 1709, Europe experienced something so severe that people who lived through it believed the world itself was ending. The cold did not simply arrive as winter normally does. It came suddenly, violently, and without mercy. Rivers turned to stone, trees exploded from frozen sap. Entire villages woke up to temperatures so low that even the strongest men struggled to breathe. Historians would later call it the Great Frost of 1709. For months the cold tightened its grip across Europe and parts of Asia. From France to Russia, from Italy to Scandinavia, the land froze under a sky that seemed determined to punish the living. But to understand the terror of that winter, we must first look at the world just before it arrived. Europe at the beginning of the 18th century was already living on the edge of hardship. Farming was unpredictable. Most people depended entirely on the harvest from the previous year. If crops failed, hunger quickly followed. Food was stored carefully through autumn in preparation for winter. Barrels of grain, dried meats, and root vegetables were placed in barns and underground cellars. These supplies had to last until spring. People expected winter to be cold. Snow was normal. Frozen ponds were common. But nothing prepared them for what happened in January of 1709. The year 1708 had ended quietly. December was cold, but not unusually so. Families across Europe celebrated Christmas with small gatherings around fireplaces. Bread was baked. Ale was poured. Children played outside in the snow. The air felt ordinary. Then, during the first days of January, something changed. The temperature began to drop. At first it seemed like a normal cold wave. Farmers noticed their wells freezing more quickly. Livestock breathed clouds of steam in the morning air. But within a few nights, the cold deepened beyond anything anyone could remember. In France, people woke to find their windows frozen from the inside. Ice formed on the walls of houses, where the warmth of human breath met the frigid air. In Germany, travelers reported that the wind felt like knives against their faces. In England, the frost grew thicker each day. Then the real nightmare began. One night, the temperature plunged so dramatically that water froze inside homes. Buckets left near the fire hardened into solid blocks of ice. Wine turned to slush inside barrels. Oil lamps refused to burn properly. Outside, trees began to crack. When sap inside a tree freezes suddenly, the pressure can cause the trunk to split apart with explosive force. During that winter, people reported hearing loud gunshot-like sounds in forests throughout Europe. Those sounds were trees bursting from the cold. Animals suffered immediately. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight. Horses refused to move across frozen ground. Cattle collapsed in fields where farmers could no longer break the ice covering their water troughs. Rivers froze quickly. At first the surface hardened into thin sheets. But as temperatures continued dropping, the ice thickened day by day until entire rivers became solid highways of frozen water. In Paris, the Seine River stopped flowing. In London, the Thames froze so hard that people began walking across it. At first this seemed exciting. Children played on the ice. Merchants pushed carts across frozen rivers to shorten travel routes. But the joy did not last. The cold grew worse, and worse, and worse. By mid-January, Europe was locked inside a frozen prison. Temperatures fell so low that historians estimate some regions reached nearly -20 degrees Celsius, an unimaginable number for much of Western Europe at the time. Homes were not built for such cold. Peasant houses were made from wood, mud, and straw. Even stone houses had poor insulation. Fireplaces struggled to keep rooms warm. People wore layers of wool and animal skins, yet still shivered through the night. Many woke to frost covering their blankets. In villages across France, priests began recording deaths that seemed unusual. Elderly people who went to bed simply never woke up. Children developed fevers from exposure. Farmers who worked outside too long returned with blackened fingers and toes. Frostbite became common. Travel became nearly impossible. Roads disappeared under snowdrifts. Wheels froze to the ground. Horses struggled to pull heavy carts across ice. Carriages sometimes became trapped overnight in blizzards. Passengers froze to death before morning. In the countryside, isolation grew worse each day. Villages that depended on nearby towns for supplies found themselves cut off. Bakers could not receive grain shipments. Markets closed. And food began to run out. The true horror of the Great Frost was not just the cold itself. It was what the cold destroyed. Winter crops died first. Wheat fields that had been planted in autumn froze completely beneath the soil. The roots died silently beneath layers of ice. Vineyards across France and Italy were devastated. Grapevines cannot survive extreme freezing. Thousands of acres of vineyards were killed in a matter of weeks. This meant not only the loss of wine, but also the loss of future harvests that farmers depended on for income. Olive trees in southern Europe froze as well. Some trees that had grown for centuries were killed by that winter. In northern regions, orchards suffered terribly. Apple and pear trees split apart as their trunks froze. The agricultural damage would haunt Europe for years. But the people living through that winter did not yet know the full consequences. They were simply trying to survive the night. Inside homes, families gathered close to fireplaces. Wood became precious. Forests near villages were quickly stripped of fallen branches. Some desperate people began cutting living trees just to keep warm. Others burned furniture. Chairs, tables, even doors were thrown into fires. In some cases, entire barns were dismantled piece by piece for fuel. Yet even with constant fires, warmth was never guaranteed. Cold air slipped through every crack in wooden walls. At night, the temperature inside houses sometimes dropped below freezing anyway. People slept wearing their coats. Some slept sitting upright near the fire so the flames would not die out. But sleep brought its own dangers. Many who fell asleep too close to the fire inhaled too much smoke and suffocated. Others simply froze during the night when the flames burned out. Morning often revealed tragedy. Neighbors discovered frozen bodies in beds. Families woke to find loved ones motionless beside them. The cold was relentless, and the worst part was that nobody knew how long it would last. Winter normally loosened its grip by late February. But in 1709, January had only just begun, and Europe was about to face the coldest weeks in recorded history. As January of 1709 continued, the cold did not weaken. Instead, it tightened its grip across Europe with a force that people struggled to comprehend. What had begun as an unusually harsh cold wave had now become something far more terrifying. The frost was no longer a temporary hardship. It had become a disaster that touched nearly every part of daily life. Villages that had survived countless winters suddenly found themselves unprepared. The cold seemed unnatural, as if the air itself had turned against the living. In many places, the first sign that something truly extraordinary was happening came from the rivers. Normally, rivers freeze slowly. The edges harden first while the center continues to flow. Even in cold winters, strong currents prevent complete freezing. But during the Great Frost of 1709, temperatures fell so rapidly that rivers froze solid from bank to bank. Across France, the great rivers stopped moving. The Loire hardened into a wide field of thick ice. The Seine, which flowed through Paris and carried trade boats every day, became silent and motionless. Ships that had been traveling along its waters became trapped in place, frozen into the river as if captured by an invisible hand. Sailors attempted to break the ice using axes and long metal poles, but the frozen surface was far too thick. Within days, the ships were completely immobilized. In Paris, the river that had once been a highway of commerce became a frozen road. At first, the city's residents were fascinated by the sight. Children ran across the ice laughing, their boots sliding over the glassy surface. Vendors walked across the frozen river carrying baskets of food and firewood. But the excitement slowly turned into worry. The river had stopped supplying the city. Paris depended heavily on shipments of grain and supplies that arrived by boat. With the river frozen solid, those deliveries ended. Markets began to empty. Meanwhile, in England, a similar scene unfolded along the River Thames. The Thames had frozen before in earlier centuries, but rarely with such strength. By mid-January, the ice was thick enough to support crowds of people. Londoners, always eager to turn unusual events into celebrations, began building stalls directly on the frozen river. Merchants carried wooden planks onto the ice and set up temporary shops. Soon the frozen Thames turned into something remarkable. A winter festival. Fires burned on the ice as vendors roasted meat and sold hot drinks to freezing visitors. Bakers carried ovens onto the frozen surface to sell fresh bread and pastries. Small tents appeared, offering games and entertainment. Musicians played fiddles and drums while crowds gathered around them, stamping their feet to stay warm. Printers even set up small presses on the ice, producing souvenirs that read, "Printed on the frozen Thames." This strange celebration would later be remembered as one of the most famous frost fairs in London's history. But even while people laughed and celebrated on the frozen river, the cold continued to worsen. Beyond the cities, the countryside was suffering terribly. Farmers faced a nightmare that grew worse with every passing day. Livestock began dying in large numbers. Cows and sheep require constant access to water, but troughs froze solid overnight. Farmers tried to break the ice each morning, but the frozen layers became thicker and harder. Some farmers used heavy hammers to smash the ice apart. Others lit fires beside water troughs to keep them from freezing. But in many places, the cold was simply too strong. Animals grew weak from thirst and hunger. Many collapsed in barns where farmers could do nothing but watch helplessly. The loss of livestock was devastating. For many families, a single cow represented their entire source of milk, butter, and income. When that animal died, the family's survival became uncertain. In Eastern Europe, the cold became even more brutal. Across the plains of Poland and Russia, endless winds carried icy air across open fields. Temperatures plunged lower than those in Western Europe. Travelers reported that breath froze on their beards and eyelashes. Soldiers stationed along military borders suffered terribly. Many armies were already engaged in conflicts at the time, including the ongoing Great Northern War between Sweden and Russia. Armies are difficult to maintain during winter, even under normal conditions. Food must be transported long distances, and soldiers must remain healthy enough to fight. During the Great Frost of 1709, these problems multiplied dramatically. Soldiers woke up in tents covered with ice. Some found their boots frozen solid during the night. Others discovered that their water containers had turned into blocks of ice. Fires struggled to burn in the powerful winds, sweeping across the frozen land. Many soldiers developed severe frostbite. Fingers turned black, toes lost feeling entirely. In some cases, military surgeons were forced to amputate frozen limbs in order to save a soldier's life. But even these desperate measures often failed. Entire groups of soldiers died during the coldest nights of that winter. Meanwhile, the cold was not only destroying people and animals, it was also destroying the land itself. Forests across Europe began to suffer enormous damage. Trees that had stood for decades or even centuries were suddenly vulnerable. As temperatures dropped far below freezing, the moisture inside tree trunks turned into expanding ice. This pressure caused the wood to crack violently. People walking near forests sometimes heard thunder-like sounds echoing through the trees. When they investigated, they found massive trunks split open from top to bottom. The damage to orchards was particularly heartbreaking. Fruit trees represent years of patient care. Farmers plant them knowing they will not produce full harvests for many seasons. But during the winter of 1709, entire orchards died in a matter of days. Apple trees froze so deeply that their bark peeled away from the trunk. Pear trees collapsed under the weight of ice forming along their branches. In southern Europe, where winters are normally mild, farmers faced an even greater shock. Olive trees, which normally survive for centuries, began dying across large regions. Olives are extremely sensitive to deep frost. The sudden cold of 1709 killed enormous numbers of these trees. For communities that depended on olive oil for cooking, lighting, and trade, this loss was catastrophic. But the most terrifying consequence of the frost was something that people did not immediately see: the destruction of the coming harvest. Under the frozen ground, winter wheat had already died. Wheat planted in autumn normally survives the winter and begins growing again in spring. But the intense frost penetrated deep into the soil, killing the roots. Farmers did not yet know it, but the fields that looked quiet beneath the snow were already ruined. When spring arrived, nothing would grow. This meant that even if people survived the winter, hunger would follow. Across Europe, people began praying for relief. Church bells rang daily in many towns, as priests led prayers asking for warmer weather. Some believed the frost was a punishment sent by God. Others blamed unusual signs in the sky or strange weather patterns from earlier years. No one truly understood what had caused the disaster. All they knew was that the cold seemed endless. Every morning the air felt just as cruel as the day before. Every night the frost returned even stronger. And January was still not finished. The worst nights of the Great Frost were still ahead. By the final weeks of January in 1709, Europe had entered the most brutal phase of the winter. What had begun as shocking cold had now become something far worse. The frost had settled across the continent like a heavy blanket of silence, freezing rivers, fields, forests, and cities alike. The land itself seemed frozen in time. Morning after morning, the sun rose weakly through pale gray skies. Its light offered almost no warmth. Even during the brightest hours of the day, temperatures remained far below freezing. People began to understand that this was no ordinary winter. Across villages and towns, the cold shaped every moment of daily life. Simple tasks that had once taken minutes now required enormous effort. Drawing water from a well, for example, had become a daily struggle. Wells froze quickly during the night. Thick ice formed across their surfaces, sometimes several inches deep. Villagers had to break through this frozen layer using heavy tools before lowering their buckets. But sometimes the ice extended far down the well shaft. In those cases, the water itself had frozen solid. Without water, survival became far more difficult. Families had to melt snow or ice near their fires, using precious firewood just to produce drinking water. Fuel had already become one of the most valuable resources in Europe. By this point in the winter, forests near most villages had been stripped of easily gathered wood. People walked farther and farther from their homes, searching for fallen branches or dead trees. Some traveled miles through snowdrifts just to find enough wood for a single night's fire. Those who could not find fuel faced terrible choices. Furniture was burned. Wooden tools were sacrificed to the flames. In extreme cases, people dismantled parts of their own homes to feed the fire. Doors, beams, and wooden fences disappeared piece by piece as families struggled to keep warm. But even these sacrifices sometimes failed. The cold penetrated houses so deeply that frost formed inside bedrooms. Families woke to see thin layers of ice covering water jugs and bowls. Sometimes frost formed along the edges of blankets. The human body can only endure extreme cold for so long. Even healthy adults began suffering serious illness. Coughing became common. Chest infections spread quickly through crowded homes, where families stayed close together for warmth. Doctors who possessed very limited medical knowledge at the time could do little to help. They prescribed herbal mixtures, warm broth, and rest beside the fire. But in many cases, the cold simply overwhelmed the sick. Death records kept by churches began to grow longer. In some villages, the number of funerals doubled or tripled compared to normal winters. Yet burial itself had become difficult. The frozen ground was nearly impossible to dig. Gravediggers struggled for hours using heavy iron tools just to open shallow graves. Sometimes fires were lit on the ground first in order to thaw the soil enough for digging. Even then, the earth resisted their efforts. In some towns, bodies had to be stored temporarily in churches or barns, until the ground softened enough for burial. The cold had turned even the final act of death into a challenge. Meanwhile, the countryside continued to suffer enormous losses. Farmers walked through their frozen fields, each day hoping to see signs that some crops might survive beneath the snow. But there was little hope. The frost had penetrated deep into the soil, killing the roots of winter wheat and barley. When the ground eventually thawed months later, many fields would reveal nothing but dead plants. But in January of 1709, farmers could only guess at the damage. What they could see clearly was the destruction of their animals. Livestock death increased rapidly during the coldest weeks. Sheep huddled together inside barns, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Many grew weak from lack of fresh water. Cattle struggled to stand on icy barn floors. Horses, essential for travel and farming, became especially vulnerable. Their hooves slipped on frozen ground, sometimes causing serious injuries. When a horse died, it was more than just the loss of an animal. For many farmers, it meant the loss of transportation, plowing power, and income. Across Europe, entire barns slowly emptied as animals died from cold, hunger, or disease. But perhaps the most frightening change came from the forests. Wild animals, desperate for food, began moving closer to human settlements. Deer wandered into villages searching for anything edible. Hungry wolves followed herds of livestock, and sometimes even approached barns at night. In some remote areas, villagers reported wolves attacking weakened animals only a short distance from their homes. This increased fear among people already struggling to survive the winter. Children were warned not to wander outside alone. Travel between villages became dangerous. Yet despite these threats, people still needed to move in order to find food. By late January, food shortages had begun appearing in many towns. Markets that once overflowed with vegetables, grain, and meat now looked strangely empty. Merchants who normally traveled between regions could no longer reach their destinations. Roads were buried beneath deep snow and ice. Wagon wheels froze to the ground. Horses grew too weak to pull heavy loads through drifts that sometimes reached waist height. Without these deliveries, towns depended entirely on whatever food had already been stored. Prices rose quickly. Bread became more expensive each week. Poor families struggled to buy enough flour to feed themselves. Some began mixing grain with crushed roots or other ingredients to stretch their supplies. But these measures could only delay the inevitable. As January approached its final days, a deep sense of fear spread across Europe. People began asking the same question everywhere. How much longer can this winter last? The sky offered no answers. Day after day, the cold continued. Night after night, temperatures plunged even lower. When February of 1709 finally arrived, many people across Europe hoped that the worst of the winter had already passed. In most years, the cold would begin to weaken during this time. Days would grow slightly longer. The sun would climb a little higher in the sky. Snow would begin melting slowly from rooftops and roads. But in 1709, February brought no relief. Instead, the cold continued with the same merciless strength that had defined January. In some places, it even grew worse. The frozen landscape stretched endlessly across the continent. Rivers remained locked beneath thick sheets of ice. Fields lay silent under heavy snow. The forest stood motionless, their branches weighed down by frost that glittered in the weak sunlight. By this point, people were exhausted. Weeks of constant cold had drained both physical strength and emotional hope. Families that had once believed the frost would soon end were beginning to realize that they might face an entire season trapped in these conditions. Daily life had become a struggle for survival. In cities, the effects of the frozen rivers were becoming more severe. Waterways had always served as Europe's most important transportation routes. Grain, firewood, coal, and livestock were normally shipped along these rivers in large boats. Now those routes were completely closed. Ships remained frozen in place along riverbanks and ports. Some had become so firmly trapped in the ice that sailors abandoned them until spring. Without these supply routes, cities began to feel the full weight of the disaster. Food markets that once bustled with activity now looked thin and quiet. Bakers struggled to obtain enough flour to continue their work. Bread prices rose dramatically. For the wealthy, higher prices were frustrating but manageable. They still had money to purchase food. For the poor, it was devastating. Many families could no longer afford enough bread to feed themselves every day. Parents often gave their portions to their children, pretending they were not hungry. Some households began reducing meals to once a day. Others relied on soups made from whatever ingredients remained in their kitchens. The cold made hunger even harder to endure. When the body lacks food, it loses the ability to produce heat effectively. People who were already underfed now felt the cold more intensely. Shivering became constant. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the situation grew even darker. Farmers had little left to protect their animals. Many barns had already lost a large portion of their livestock. The animals that remained were weak and underfed. Frozen pastures provided no grass. Hay supplies were nearly gone. Some farmers were forced to slaughter animals earlier than planned simply because they could no longer keep them alive. This created a temporary supply of meat, but it also meant that fewer animals would survive to reproduce in the coming seasons. The long-term consequences of this winter were slowly unfolding. But even worse problems were beginning to appear. As the weeks passed, some regions began experiencing strange and dangerous changes in the frozen rivers. Ice does not remain perfectly stable forever. As temperatures shift slightly, the massive frozen sheets begin to crack and move. Along certain rivers, especially those with strong currents beneath the ice, enormous pressure began building below the frozen surface. People living near these rivers sometimes heard deep rumbling sounds during the night. At first, they thought the noises were distant thunder. But when they stepped outside, the sky was clear. The sounds were coming from the rivers themselves. Beneath the thick ice, water was still slowly flowing. When cracks formed, enormous sections of ice could suddenly shift or break apart. In some towns, large blocks of ice were pushed against bridges and riverbanks. The pressure grew so powerful that wooden structures along the water sometimes snapped apart. In a few cases, when warmer air briefly arrived, partial melting caused sections of ice to break loose and move downstream. These moving ice fields were incredibly dangerous. They crashed into riverbanks, docks, and buildings near the water. Some houses built too close to the river were damaged or destroyed by these sudden ice floods. People who had been walking or working on frozen rivers sometimes found themselves caught in these shifting surfaces. Several accidents were recorded where individuals fell into freezing water when the ice beneath them suddenly broke apart. In most cases, survival was nearly impossible. But even as these dangers appeared, people continued to gather on frozen rivers in certain cities. In London, the frozen Thames remained the center of the famous Frost Fair. The celebration had grown even larger during February. Stalls selling food, drinks, and small goods covered large sections of the river's surface. Musicians performed for crowds wrapped in thick coats. Horse-drawn sleds even traveled across the frozen river carrying passengers for short rides. It was a strange contrast. Above the ice, people celebrated with laughter and excitement. Below the ice, dark waters pressed against the frozen surface, slowly weakening it. Meanwhile, across Europe, hunger was beginning to spread. In France, government officials grew deeply concerned about the rising price of grain. The country had already suffered poor harvests in earlier years. Now the destruction of winter crops meant that the next harvest might fail completely. Authorities attempted to control grain prices and prevent hoarding. But fear made people desperate. Some merchants hid their grain supplies, waiting for prices to rise even higher. Others secretly transported food away from certain regions where shortages were worst. This behavior increased public anger. In a few towns, hungry crowds gathered outside bakeries demanding lower prices for bread. These early protests were small, but they revealed how fragile society had become. The Great Frost was not only a natural disaster. It was slowly becoming a social crisis. If the cold continued much longer, it could push entire regions toward famine and unrest. And still, winter showed no sign of ending. Snow continued falling across much of the continent. Cold winds swept through valleys and plains. Fires burned day and night in homes that never seemed warm enough. People waited for the first true signs of spring. By the middle of February 1709, the long winter had begun to reveal its most frightening consequence. For weeks, people had focused on surviving the cold itself. They had worried about frozen rivers, dying animals, and the struggle to keep their homes warm. But now a new fear was spreading across Europe. The fear of hunger. At first the signs were small. Bakers in several towns quietly announced that their bread would cost slightly more than before. Merchants explained that grain shipments had been delayed because roads and rivers were frozen. Customers grumbled but paid the higher prices. After all, the winter had been unusually harsh. A temporary shortage seemed understandable. Yet as the days passed, the situation continued to worsen. The frozen rivers that once carried large shipments of grain remained locked under thick layers of ice. Wagons could not travel long distances across snow-covered roads. Even when merchants attempted to transport food by land, the journeys were slow and dangerous. Horses were weak from the cold. Many had already died. Those that remained struggled to pull heavy wagons through deep snow and icy winds. Sometimes a journey that normally took 3 days required more than a week. Food was moving across Europe far more slowly than usual. In large cities, this created a dangerous imbalance. Thousands of people depended on daily deliveries of flour and grain. When those supplies slowed, bakeries could not produce enough bread for everyone. Lines began forming outside bakeries early in the morning. Women carrying baskets waited in freezing air for hours, hopping to buy a loaf before the supply ran out. Sometimes the bread was gone before everyone reached the door. Those who arrived too late returned home empty-handed. This created tension in many communities. People who had never experienced real hunger before now faced the frightening possibility that they might not be able to feed their families. Across France, government officials began receiving reports from local towns describing rising food prices and growing public anger. France was particularly vulnerable. The country had already faced difficult harvests in previous years. The destruction of winter crops during the Great Frost meant that the next harvest might be disastrously small. Officials feared that famine could spread if food prices continued rising. To prevent panic, authorities attempted to control the price of grain. Laws were introduced that limited how much merchants could charge for bread and flour. The government also ordered grain stores to be opened in certain regions to increase supply. But these measures had mixed results. Some merchants obeyed the price limits. Others tried to avoid them by hiding their grain or selling it secretly at higher prices. This behavior made many citizens furious. Rumors began spreading that wealthy merchants were deliberately hoarding food, while ordinary people suffered. Whether these rumors were true or not, they fueled growing anger in towns and cities. In a few places, crowds gathered outside grain warehouses demanding that food be released. Local officials sometimes had to call soldiers to protect these buildings. These early disturbances were not yet full riots, but they revealed how fragile public order had become. The cold winter had pushed society to its limits. Meanwhile, in rural areas, farmers faced an equally frightening situation. The frozen fields remained silent beneath thick layers of snow. Many farmers had begun digging into the soil to examine the condition of their winter wheat. What they found was devastating. The plants were dead. The intense frost had killed the roots completely. Normally, these crops would begin growing again once the snow melted in early spring. But now the fields showed no sign of life. This meant that the coming harvest would be drastically reduced. Even if farmers planted new crops later in the year, the lost winter wheat represented a major portion of Europe's annual food supply. The realization spread slowly from village to village. The winter had already taken lives and animals. Now it threatened the future harvest as well. This knowledge created deep anxiety. Farmers who had once believed that spring would solve their problems began to understand that the crisis might continue long after the snow melted. In southern Europe, the situation looked equally grim. Olive trees that had frozen earlier in the winter now showed clear signs of death. When farmers cut into the branches, they found dark, lifeless wood inside. Entire groves had been destroyed. For generations, olive oil had served as a crucial product across Mediterranean regions. It was used for cooking, lighting, medicine, and trade. The loss of these trees meant that olive oil production would collapse in many areas. Similarly, vineyards across France, Italy, and Spain had suffered enormous damage. Many grapevines had frozen completely. Wine production, one of the most important industries in Europe, would decline sharply in the years following the Great Frost. But during February of 1709, these long-term consequences were only beginning to become clear. Part 6. The coldest winter in history, the Great Frost of 1709. By the final weeks of February 1709, The long winter had begun to break the patience of many communities across Europe. The cold itself was still severe, but now another force was growing stronger with each passing day. Desperation. For nearly 2 months people had endured frozen rivers, empty markets, and endless nights of bitter cold. Families had burned furniture to keep their homes warm. Farmers had watched their animals die one by one. Bakers struggled to produce bread while lines of hungry citizens waited outside their shops. Now the tension that had quietly built across towns and villages began to spill into the open. In several cities, crowds gathered in marketplaces where food had once been abundant. Merchants arrived with small supplies of grain or flour, hopping to sell their goods before returning home through the frozen streets. But the crowds waiting for that food were larger than the supplies themselves. When merchants announced the price for their grain, angry voices sometimes rose from the crowd. People shouted that the price was unfair. They accused traders of greed. Some insisted that merchants were hiding food somewhere else, waiting to sell it later for even more money. Whether these accusations were true or not, the anger they created was real. In a few towns, the situation quickly turned violent. Crowds pushed forward toward the merchant wagons. Bags of grain were torn open. Flour spilled onto the frozen ground as people struggled to gather whatever they could. Local officials attempted to calm the crowds, but fear and hunger had already weakened the normal rules of society. Soldiers were sometimes called to restore order. But even soldiers understood the suffering of the people. Many of them had families facing the same shortages at home. These disturbances were the first clear signs that the Great Frost was no longer only a natural disaster. It had become a social crisis. Meanwhile, in the countryside, life continued growing harder. The snow that covered fields and forests had now remained for many weeks without melting. In some regions, the drifts had grown incredibly deep. Farmers walking through their land sometimes sank up to their knees with each step. Travel between villages became slow and exhausting. Some people decided that remaining in their isolated communities was no longer possible. They began leaving. Small groups of villagers packed their belongings onto sleds or wagons and set out toward larger towns or cities where they hoped to find food. These journeys were extremely dangerous. Many travelers had little experience surviving long distances in such severe winter conditions. Families wrapped themselves in heavy clothing and blankets while walking through icy winds that seemed to cut through every layer. Children often rode on wagons beside bags of grain or small supplies of food. But the roads were rough and buried beneath snow. Progress was slow. Some travelers were forced to stop at abandoned barns or small roadside shelters just to survive the night. Others turned back after realizing that the journey was too difficult. Yet many continued moving, driven by the simple hope that somewhere else food might be easier to find. In cities receiving these travelers, the situation became even more crowded. More mouths meant greater pressure on already limited food supplies. Local governments tried to control the situation by distributing grain from emergency storage facilities. But those supplies were not endless. Officials worried that if the winter continued much longer, their reserves would run out. Across Europe, churches played an important role during these difficult weeks. Religious leaders organized prayer gatherings, asking for relief from the cold. Church bells rang frequently as communities came together to ask for warmer weather, and a successful harvest later in the year. Many people believed the frost had spiritual meaning. Some saw it as a punishment for sins committed by society. Others believed it was simply a test of faith that people must endure with patience. Regardless of the explanation, the churches provided comfort during a time when hope was difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, nature itself seemed to be struggling under the weight of the frost. Bird populations had declined sharply during the winter. Many small birds simply could not find enough food beneath the snow. Their bodies froze during cold nights. Travelers often reported seeing frozen birds scattered across roads and fields. Large animals also suffered. Deer that had once roamed freely through forests now appeared thin and weak. Hungry wolves continued approaching villages more frequently in search of food. Although attacks on humans were rare, the presence of predators added another layer of fear to an already frightening season. The forests themselves showed visible damage. Trees that had cracked earlier in the winter now stood with deep splits along their trunks. Some had fallen entirely after strong winds pushed against their weakened structures. Woodcutters discovered entire sections of forest filled with broken trees. This damage would later provide abundant firewood once the snow melted, but during the winter it remained difficult to reach. Despite all these hardships, time continued moving forward. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the days began growing longer. Sunlight lasted a little later each afternoon. For people who had spent weeks trapped in freezing darkness, this small change provided a tiny measure of hope. The cold was still powerful, but many began wondering if the worst might finally be approaching its end. Yet the winter of 1709 had one more cruel surprise waiting. As temperatures began fluctuating slightly toward the end of February and early March, the massive ice sheets covering Europe's rivers would soon begin to break apart. And when that happened, the frozen waterways would unleash a new wave of danger. For most people, the immediate concern remained survival. Families continued burning whatever fuel they could find. Wood piles that had once been carefully saved for the entire winter were now nearly empty. Some communities organized groups of men to travel into distant forests, searching for additional firewood. These journeys were dangerous. Deep snow made travel exhausting. Cold winds cut through even the thickest clothing. Men who stayed outside too long risked frostbite or even death. Yet they continued going, because without firewood their families could not survive the night. Inside homes, people tried to conserve energy and warmth. Families gathered in a single room rather than heating the entire house. Blankets and heavy clothing were worn day and night. Children were encouraged to stay close to the fire whenever possible. But even these precautions could not fully protect them. Illness continued spreading through many communities. Doctors reported increasing cases of respiratory infections, fevers, and severe exhaustion caused by cold exposure. The elderly suffered the most. Many older people simply lacked the strength to endure such extreme conditions for so many weeks. By late February, church records across Europe showed rising death numbers. And still the winter continued. Snowstorms swept across parts of the continent. Frozen rivers remained solid highways of ice. The cold air showed little sign of retreat. Yet far beneath the frozen ground, tiny changes were slowly beginning. The first hints that winter might eventually loosen its grip. But those changes would take time. and Europe still had many weeks of hardship ahead. As March of 1709 slowly approached, people across Europe began noticing the smallest signs of change in the long and merciless winter. For weeks the cold had seemed endless, as if the world itself had become trapped in ice. But now, subtle shifts in the air hinted that the season might finally be weakening. The sun rose a little earlier each morning. Its light lingered slightly longer in the evenings. These changes were small, almost invisible, yet after so many weeks of darkness and cold, people paid close attention to every detail of the sky. During the day, temperatures sometimes rose just enough to soften the very top layer of snow. This did not melt the drifts completely, but it created a thin crust that sparkled beneath the sunlight. For a few brief hours, the air felt slightly less painful to breathe. But the nights remained bitterly cold. After sunset, the temperature dropped quickly, freezing whatever moisture had formed during the day. Roads that had softened under the sun turned into sheets of hard ice once darkness returned. Travel remained extremely dangerous. Horse hooves slipped easily on the frozen ground. Wagons struggled to maintain balance along narrow rural paths. Yet despite these dangers, people began moving again. The possibility that winter might soon end encouraged farmers and merchants to resume their journeys between towns. Caravans of sleds and wagons appeared on certain roads, transporting whatever goods remained available. These travelers hoped to sell their supplies before spring fully arrived. But while the land showed small signs of change, the frozen rivers remained one of the greatest dangers. For more than 2 months, enormous sheets of ice had covered rivers across Europe. In many places, the ice had grown incredibly thick, forming solid platforms that supported people, animals, and even temporary markets. Now those frozen surfaces were beginning to weaken. During warmer hours of the day, small cracks formed across the ice. At first, these cracks seemed harmless. Thin lines spread across the surface like delicate spider webs. People walking across the rivers sometimes heard faint popping sounds beneath their feet. Most believed the ice was still strong enough to support them. But deep below the surface, powerful forces were beginning to move. Water currents that had been trapped beneath the ice throughout the winter were now pushing harder against the frozen layers. As temperatures slowly shifted, the ice began loosening from the riverbanks. The pressure continued building day after day. Then, in several regions, the frozen rivers began to break. When river ice breaks after such a long freeze, it does not melt gently. Instead, enormous slabs suddenly crack apart and begin moving downstream. These massive blocks of ice can weigh thousands of kilograms. When they start moving, they behave like slow, crushing waves. Villagers living near rivers were often the first to notice the change. During the night, they heard deep rumbling sounds echoing through the frozen valleys. The noise resembled distant thunder or heavy wagons rolling across stone roads. But when they stepped outside, they saw something far more alarming. The river ice was shifting. Large sections were rising and tilting against each other. Cracks widened until entire plates of ice snapped apart with loud explosions. Once the ice began moving, it traveled downstream with terrifying force. These moving ice fields smashed into bridges that had survived the entire winter. Wooden supports splintered under the pressure. In several towns, bridges collapsed completely as huge ice blocks crashed against them. Riverbanks were also vulnerable. Houses, barns, and warehouses built close to the water were sometimes struck by drifting ice. Walls cracked, foundations weakened. Some structures were pushed partially into the river itself. People rushed to move their belongings away from the river's edge, fearing that the shifting ice might destroy their homes. Meanwhile, the famous Frost Fair on the frozen Thames in London faced its own danger. For weeks the fair had attracted enormous crowds. Merchants, musicians, entertainers, and curious visitors had gathered on the frozen river, turning the ice into a strange winter marketplace. But by early March, careful observers began noticing that the ice beneath the fair was no longer completely stable. Small pools of water appeared between the cracks. Some sections of the frozen surface felt slightly softer underfoot. Officials and merchants slowly realized that continuing the celebration could become dangerous. If the ice broke suddenly while hundreds of people were standing on it, the results could be disastrous. Gradually, the stalls and tents were dismantled. Vendors packed their goods and returned to the riverbanks. The once busy frozen marketplace slowly disappeared. Soon afterward, sections of the Thames ice finally broke apart, floating downstream toward the sea. The Great Frost Fair of 1709 had come to an end. Across Europe, similar scenes unfolded along countless rivers. The breaking ice brought both relief and fear. On one hand, it meant that the frozen grip of winter was finally loosening. Waterways would soon reopen for trade and transportation. On the other hand, the sudden ice floods caused destruction that added to the suffering already experienced during the winter. Communities that had survived the cold now faced damaged bridges, flooded riverbanks, and ruined buildings. But even with these problems, many people welcomed the change. After months of silence, the rivers were finally moving again. The sound of flowing water felt almost like a promise that the long winter might soon end. Yet the true consequences of the Great Frost were still waiting beneath the soil. When the snow finally melted, farmers would discover the full destruction of their crops. And that discovery would lead to one of the most difficult periods Europe had faced in years. When spring of 1709 finally arrived, Europe seemed to awaken from a long and merciless nightmare. Snow and ice slowly receded, and rivers returned to their natural flow. The thawing of frozen land brought relief, but it also revealed the full scale of the devastation left behind by the Great Frost. What had seemed like temporary hardship now turned into a crisis that would affect millions for months and even years to come. In the countryside, farmers were the first to realize the true extent of the damage. Fields that had once promised a new season of growth now lay barren. Winter wheat, rye, and barley had been killed by the prolonged frost. When the snow melted, the dead roots and shattered stalks became visible, leaving nothing but lifeless soil. Farmers walked slowly through their ruined fields, knowing that their survival, and the survival of their families, depended on the harvest that would no longer come. Some attempted to plant spring crops in hopes of salvaging something, but the timing was already late, and the soil, still cold and wet, offered little promise. Many regions would face severe food shortages before the next harvest. Livestock losses were equally devastating. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses that had survived the winter were now weak, emaciated, and unable to reproduce quickly. Many farmers had lost entire herds, leaving them with little chance to recover. Horses that survived were often too weak to plow the fields, further delaying the planting of new crops. Communities realized that the ripple effects of this winter would last far beyond the thaw. In towns and cities, the human cost of the frost became painfully visible. During the coldest months, Countless deaths had occurred due to hypothermia, illness, and malnutrition. Families who had survived now faced another challenge, feeding themselves in the wake of ruined harvests. Grain prices, which had already spiked during the winter, continued to rise. For the poor, bread became a luxury, and many were forced to reduce meals or subsist on wild plants and roots. Governments tried to respond. In France, King Louis XIV ordered the release of emergency grain stores, hoping to stabilize markets. Officials also attempted to organize relief for starving peasants, sending grain from regions less affected by the frost. Despite these efforts, distribution was slow and uneven. Roads remained difficult to travel, and the destruction of carts and wagons during the frozen months meant that many areas went without aid for weeks. The destruction of crops also led to social unrest. Desperate populations sometimes rioted at bakeries or grain warehouses. In some towns, angry crowds looted stores in search of food. Authorities struggled to maintain order, knowing that the combined effects of famine and frustration could ignite widespread rebellion. The social fabric of Europe, already stretched by wars and political tensions, faced one of its greatest tests. Across southern Europe, the loss of olive trees and vineyards compounded the crisis. Olive oil and wine, critical for both daily life and trade, were in short supply. Vineyards in France and Italy had frozen completely, eliminating much of the year's wine production. Olive groves in Spain and southern France had been destroyed, affecting both consumption and export. This economic blow would be felt for years, as communities struggled to rebuild these vital sources of income. In northern Europe, the thaw revealed damaged forests and broken infrastructure. Trees split by frost had fallen, blocking roads and pathways. Bridges weakened by ice floods were unstable or destroyed entirely. Rivers, which had begun flowing again, carried debris downstream, threatening mills and settlements along their banks. The recovery of these towns would require immense labor and resources. The human toll extended beyond hunger and cold. Disease began spreading rapidly as communities dealt with weeks of malnutrition and exposure. Children, weakened by lack of food and extreme cold, were particularly vulnerable. Epidemics of fever and respiratory illnesses became common in towns and villages alike. Local healers were overwhelmed, and hospitals were unprepared for the sudden influx of patients. Yet even amid this devastation, some signs of resilience appeared. Villagers worked together to repair broken homes and barns. Communities shared scarce resources, pooling firewood and food. Religious institutions continued to provide shelter and care for those most in need. People who had endured the harshest weeks of winter began to understand that survival required cooperation and mutual support. The Great Frost of 1709 had left Europe forever changed. Economically, socially, and psychologically, the continent faced months and years of recovery. Crops were destroyed, livestock decimated, trade disrupted, and families traumatized. The memory of the long, bitter months of frost lingered in the collective consciousness of the people. For many, the thaw was only the beginning of another struggle, a struggle to rebuild lives and communities in a world made suddenly fragile by one of the coldest winters in history. As spring advanced in 1709, the devastation left by the Great Frost became impossible to ignore. The immediate horror of freezing temperatures had passed, but Europe now faced a long, slow crisis that would affect millions of lives. With crops destroyed, livestock weakened, and infrastructure damaged, famine and social unrest spread across the continent. In France, the impact was particularly severe. Authorities had attempted to distribute emergency grain reserves, but the scale of the disaster far exceeded their resources. Rural villages, isolated during the months of ice and snow, often received no aid. Families who had survived hypothermia and frostbite now struggled to find enough to eat. In many regions, children and the elderly suffered the most. Hunger became visible in sunken faces, listless movements, and widespread fatigue. Reports from parish records noted mortality rising not from the cold, but from starvation and disease that thrived in weakened bodies. Markets in cities told a similar story. Bread prices had skyrocketed, and the poor were forced to subsist on roots, acorns, and other foraged foods. Some urban communities experienced outright panic. Crowds occasionally surged into bakeries or storage warehouses, desperate to secure whatever flour or grain remained. Soldiers were sometimes called in to restore order, yet many officials sympathized with the plight of the hungry, understanding that their own families might have faced the same crisis under similar conditions. These tensions foreshadowed larger social upheavals that would ripple across Europe in the years that followed. In rural areas, the destruction of livestock amplified the human tragedy. Farmers who had preserved some animals through the winter now found their remaining herds weakened and susceptible to disease. Cows were too thin to produce milk, sheep and goats yielded little wool, and pigs were often lost to starvation. Many farmers faced an impossible decision: slaughter weakened animals to preserve what remained or attempt to keep them alive, risking total loss. The scarcity of livestock meant not only immediate food shortages, but also the loss of future productivity and breeding potential, creating economic challenges that would last years. Across southern Europe, the loss of vineyards and olive groves became an economic catastrophe. Wine production had collapsed, affecting not only local consumption but also trade with neighboring regions. Olive oil, a staple for cooking, lighting, and commerce, became scarce. Farmers and merchants watched as years of careful cultivation vanished in a single winter. Replanting vineyards and groves was costly and would not yield results for multiple seasons, further stretching the economic recovery. In northern and eastern Europe, the aftermath of broken rivers and destroyed infrastructure complicated relief efforts. Bridges weakened or destroyed by ice floods isolated communities, making the transport of food and essential supplies even more difficult. Fallen trees blocked roads and paths, while debris carried downstream by rivers threatened mills, homes, and farms. Villagers organized themselves to clear roads and repair bridges, but labor and resources were limited, and the work was slow. The human cost extended beyond hunger. Disease spread rapidly among populations already weakened by cold and starvation. Children, the elderly, and the infirm were most vulnerable. Epidemics of fevers, dysentery, and respiratory illnesses became common. Local healers and physicians, already limited in knowledge and resources, were overwhelmed. Some towns reported mortality rates higher than during the coldest weeks of winter itself, as malnutrition made individuals more susceptible to disease. Communities reacted in diverse ways. Mutual aid became a necessity. Families and neighbors shared scarce resources, pooling food, firewood, and shelter. Religious institutions often provided relief, offering meals, temporary housing, and spiritual support. Churches became centers for survival as much as for worship. In many villages, collective effort was essential for enduring the long recovery period. Migration emerged as another response. People from the hardest hit areas traveled to towns and cities in search of food and work. While some found relief, others faced overcrowded conditions, increased competition for limited supplies, and harsh reception from established urban populations wary of newcomers. These movements contributed to social tension, but also reshaped local demographics, creating new networks of support and adaptation. Politically, governments struggled to maintain stability. Authorities in France, England, and other affected countries monitored food prices, attempted to ration grain, and organized relief where possible. Yet the scale of the disaster revealed the limitations of state capacity in the face of natural catastrophe. Officials learned hard lessons about vulnerability, logistics, and the need for long-term planning, lessons that would influence future responses to harsh winters and agricultural crises. By late spring, the first signs of cautious recovery began to appear. Rivers fully thawed, allowing trade to resume. Some crops could be replanted, though the loss of winter grain meant that many communities would rely on imported food for months. Livestock breeding gradually restarted, but the numbers were far below pre-frost levels. Forests, stripped of fallen wood and damaged trees, required months of clearing before normal firewood supplies could be restored. Even as Europe emerged from the physical grip of the Great Frost, the psychological impact lingered. Communities remembered the nights of endless cold, the frozen rivers, the hunger, and the death. The winter of 1709 became a benchmark in memory, referenced for generations as a reminder of nature's power and the fragility of human society in the face of environmental disaster. By the summer of 1709, Europe was slowly emerging from the immediate horrors of the Great Frost, yet the continent still faced the lingering consequences of one of the coldest winters in recorded history. The thaw had returned rivers to their flow and uncovered landscapes once hidden beneath snow and ice, but what it revealed was far from hopeful. Farms were devastated, crops lost, livestock diminished, and entire communities weakened from starvation, illness, and fatigue. The destruction of winter crops had lasting effects. Fields that could have produced grain for months ahead were now barren. Farmers attempted to plant spring crops to salvage some harvest, but timing and damaged soil limited success. In many regions, yields were drastically reduced. Bread, the staple of European diets, remained scarce and expensive. Families that had survived the winter faced months of food insecurity, and for the poorest, starvation remained a real threat well into autumn. Famine began spreading beyond the countryside into urban centers. Cities, which had depended on rural grain shipments during the winter, now faced chronic shortages. Markets that had been busy prior to the frost now experienced empty shelves and soaring prices. Some areas saw entire families subsisting on roots, wild herbs, and occasional foraged meat. Chronic malnutrition weakened populations, making them more susceptible to disease and prolonging the suffering caused by the winter. International trade, once a buffer against local shortages, also suffered. Rivers and ports had been frozen for months, halting the movement of goods. Grain imports that might have relieved famine in affected areas were delayed. Merchants faced destroyed roads and bridges, as ice floods had damaged much of the infrastructure. Europe's trade networks would take months to repair, further prolonging scarcity. Governments across the continent faced immense pressure to respond. In France, Louis XIV's administration attempted to stabilize markets by releasing emergency grain reserves and regulating prices, but the scale of the disaster exceeded available resources. England and other northern nations struggled similarly, with local authorities trying to distribute food and maintain public order. The experience exposed the vulnerability of government to large-scale natural disasters and underscored the importance of strategic planning for future crises. Social unrest increased in the wake of the frost. Crowds continued to gather at bakeries, granaries, and marketplaces, demanding food and accusing merchants of hoarding. In extreme cases, riots erupted, requiring soldiers to intervene. Meanwhile, rural populations migrated towards cities in search of food and work, placing additional pressure on urban areas. Communities had to navigate both hunger and growing tension among neighbors, highlighting the fragile balance between survival and societal order. The psychological impact of the winter also lingered. Survivors carried memories of frozen rivers, dead livestock, and months spent in near-constant cold. Stories of families who had perished, of towns cut off from food, and of entire orchards destroyed became part of local histories and oral traditions. These memories would influence agricultural planning, community preparation, and cultural attitudes toward winter for generations. Environmentally, Europe's landscape had been permanently altered in some regions. Forests bore the scars of broken trees and frost-split trunks. Rivers, previously frozen for months, now carried debris and silt downstream, altering local waterways. Agricultural lands required extensive repair before they could sustain crops normally. The frost revealed the vulnerability of both human society and natural systems to extreme weather events. Despite these challenges, signs of recovery began slowly emerging. Communities began rebuilding infrastructure, repairing bridges and roads damaged during the thaw. Farmers replanted crops where possible and worked to restore livestock populations. Trade resumed gradually as rivers and ports reopened, and families started to stabilize their food supplies. Mutual aid networks and community cooperation became essential strategies for survival, reinforcing social bonds that had been tested by months of harsh winter. The Great Frost of 1709 was not just a season of extreme cold. It was a transformative event in Europe's history. Economically, socially, and environmentally, it left a mark that would last for years. The winter demonstrated the vulnerability of pre-industrial societies to climate extremes, the fragility of food systems, and the resilience of communities in the face of overwhelming natural forces. By late 1709, as the immediate crises of famine, frozen rivers, and destroyed crops began to stabilize, Europe entered a long phase of adaptation and recovery. The Great Frost had left a lasting imprint on the continent, and its effects were visible in both daily life and larger social structures. Families, communities, and governments all had to adjust to the reality of a winter that had stretched human endurance to its limits. One of the first priorities was population recovery. The months of extreme cold, hunger, and disease had caused mortality rates to rise significantly. Entire villages in northern and central Europe reported dozens or even hundreds of deaths. Many children, the most vulnerable, had not survived. Families that had lost members worked tirelessly to rebuild, and midwives and caregivers faced unprecedented demands. Communities emphasized the survival of the young and the vulnerable, ensuring that they were fed and sheltered as much as possible. Agricultural practices began to evolve in response to the frost. Farmers had learned firsthand how devastating extreme cold could be to crops and livestock. Some regions experimented with planting hardier varieties of grain that could survive harsh winters. Storage methods were rethought, with emphasis on protecting seed grain from frost and moisture. Barns and stables were reinforced to better protect animals from freezing temperatures, and the importance of firewood reserves was more widely recognized. These adjustments, though small, represented a shift in how communities prepared for winter extremes. Economically, the frost forced governments and merchants to reconsider supply chains. Disrupted trade during the winter highlighted the vulnerability of cities dependent on rural grain shipments. In response, some cities began stockpiling reserves in advance of winter, while merchants explored alternative routes to reduce dependency on frozen rivers. The frost also created opportunities for certain trades. Firewood sellers, livestock breeders, and mill operators who survived the winter could command higher prices, though this often came at the expense of widespread hardship. Socially, the shared experience of the Great Frost reshaped community relationships. Mutual aid became a central strategy for survival. Families pooled resources, neighbors shared food and firewood, and local institutions such as churches provided support networks. These cooperative practices strengthened social cohesion and built resilience against future crises. Religious faith, already a guiding force, took on even greater importance, with many seeing the winter as a test of endurance or divine will. Culturally, the winter left its mark in stories, songs, and written accounts. Chroniclers, pastors, and government officials documented the destruction, the hunger, and the resilience of the people. These records served not only as historical testimony, but also as cautionary tales about the power of nature. The Great Frost became a reference point for subsequent generations, a benchmark against which future winters would be compared. In addition to human adaptation, environmental observations grew in importance. Scholars, naturalists, and farmers took note of the relationship between prolonged cold, crop failure, and societal disruption. Some early thinkers speculated about the causes of extreme weather, laying the groundwork for later studies in climate and meteorology. The winter of 1709 highlighted how dependent human societies were on predictable seasons, and how vulnerable they could be to sudden climatic shifts. The Great Frost also had long-term economic consequences. The loss of livestock, crops, and goods disrupted trade networks for months, reducing the availability of basic necessities and affecting regional markets. Recovery required time, labor, and careful planning. Wealthy landowners could often absorb losses, but poorer farmers faced lasting hardship. Generational effects were felt as families struggled to regain economic stability, sometimes altering settlement patterns as communities migrated to areas with more reliable resources. By the end of 1709, Europe had survived the harshest winter in centuries, but the memory of its impact remained vivid. People had endured near-constant cold, food scarcity, disease, and social tension. Yet they had also adapted, rebuilt, and learned from the experience. The lessons of that winter, about preparation, cooperation, and resilience, shaped agricultural practices, social policies, and cultural narratives for decades to come. As 1709 drew to a close, the Great Frost became more than a memory of suffering. It evolved into a turning point in European history. The winter had tested the resilience of communities, governments, and economies, and its lessons continued to influence society for decades. While people had survived the immediate cold, the long-term consequences shaped agriculture, governance, culture, and daily life in profound ways. Agriculture was transformed. Farmers across France, Italy, Spain, and Northern Europe realized the vulnerability of traditional crops to extreme weather. New practices emerged, including deeper soil preparation, the use of hardy grain varieties, and improved storage methods to protect seeds and harvested crops from frost. Livestock management also changed. Barns were reinforced, and feeding strategies adjusted to conserve hay and forage during harsh winters. The memory of 1709 encouraged generations of farmers to prepare for worst-case scenarios, altering the rhythm of European agriculture. Governments likewise learned the importance of planning for environmental disasters. The frost had exposed weaknesses in grain distribution, food reserves, and disaster response. In France, England, and other affected nations, authorities began maintaining emergency stockpiles and developing early strategies to stabilize food markets in the face of scarcity. These efforts were early precursors to modern public works and disaster planning, highlighting how a single winter could ripple through social, political, and economic structures. Culturally, the Great Frost left an enduring imprint. Stories of frozen rivers, dead livestock, destroyed crops, and desperate communities were passed down through oral tradition and written chronicles. The winter became a benchmark in collective memory, often referenced in diaries, sermons, and literature as a cautionary tale about nature's power and humanity's vulnerability. Folk tales emphasized resilience, cooperation, and faith, reinforcing the idea that survival required community solidarity and careful planning. Economically, the frost reshaped trade and local markets. Regions that had lost crops or livestock became reliant on imports, while merchants adapted to new routes and storage practices to reduce the impact of future freezes. Some trades, such as firewood suppliers and seed merchants, gained prominence, while others, like small-scale farmers unable to recover their herds, faced long-term hardship. The uneven recovery reinforced social hierarchies, but also encouraged innovation and adaptability in commerce. The social fabric of Europe had been tested. Communities learned to rely on cooperation, mutual aid, and shared resources. Churches and religious institutions provided essential support, offering shelter, food, and guidance. The winter reinforced the importance of social networks, teaching that survival often depended on collective effort as much as individual endurance. By the early 1710s, Europe slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. Crops were replanted, livestock populations began to recover, and rivers flowed freely once more. Yet the memory of the Great Frost of 1709 lingered, shaping attitudes toward winter, climate, and the limits of human preparedness. Scholars, farmers, and officials alike remembered the lessons learned. That extreme weather could strike without warning, that societal resilience was tested not only by cold but by scarcity and fear, and that preparation, cooperation, and adaptability were essential for survival. The Great Frost of 1709 would remain one of the coldest, deadliest, and most transformative winters in European history. Its legacy influenced agriculture, governance, social structures, and cultural memory for generations. Though the ice eventually melted and crops returned, the shadow of that winter endured, a testament to the power of nature and the resilience of humanity in the face of unprecedented hardship. The winter of 1708-1709 would go down in history as one of the most severe Europe had ever experienced. What began as a normal winter quickly escalated into a season of extreme cold, with temperatures dropping far below anything the people of Europe had endured in living memory. By December of 1708, reports began coming from France, Germany, and England of frozen rivers, with snowfall covering towns and countryside alike. Those early warnings were only a hint of the catastrophe to come. Families began noticing the first signs of hardship as firewood supplies dwindled and homes, often poorly insulated, struggled to retain heat. Villagers wrapped themselves in layers of clothing, while parents pressed children close to the hearth, hopping to stave off frostbite. Livestock, the backbone of rural survival, showed signs of weakness, and farmers scrambled to protect their animals from freezing temperatures. Yet even the most prepared households could not fully anticipate the relentless intensity of the winter. By the turn of the new year, temperatures plunged even further. January 1709 arrived with a ferocity that stunned the continent. Rivers such as the Seine, Thames, and Loire froze over completely, allowing pedestrians to walk across surfaces that would normally be impassable. The frost was so severe that even the sea around parts of northern Europe began to show patches of ice. Many towns experienced weeks of unbroken cold, with snowfall burying homes, fields, and roads. People struggled to carry on daily life. Firewood was scarce, and families burned furniture, books, and other possessions just to maintain heat. Hunger became a silent but deadly companion, as frozen supply lines prevented regular deliveries of food. In towns, bakeries struggled to produce bread without access to sufficient grain, and the poor were often forced to survive on meager portions or whatever wild plants and roots they could forage. By February, the frost had reached terrifying proportions. Rivers, once a lifeline for commerce, remained frozen solid. The great frost fairs on the Thames in London and on other European rivers drew crowds, offering temporary amusement and social gatherings, but the surface beneath was perilous. Ice shifted, cracked, and sometimes gave way under the weight of people, livestock, or carts. The dangers were ever present, and accidents claimed lives even as communities tried to celebrate small moments of relief. The cold also took its toll on agriculture. Winter wheat, rye, and barley were destroyed by the prolonged frost. Fields that should have been dormant now revealed their fragility when snow began to melt, exposing dead crops and frozen soil. Farmers faced difficult choices: attempt to plant spring crops despite a shortened growing season, or accept the total loss of the year's harvest. Livestock losses were immense. Cattle, sheep, and pigs that had survived the worst weeks were weakened, some unable to produce milk or reproduce. Horses, essential for plowing and transport, were emaciated and in many cases lost entirely. Hunger spread rapidly. Markets emptied, bread became a luxury, and families in both urban and rural areas faced chronic food shortages. Desperation led to social unrest. Crowds gathered at bakeries and granaries demanding supplies, sometimes resorting to riots when access was denied. Governments attempted to respond, distributing emergency reserves and regulating prices, but the scale of the crisis exceeded their capacity. In rural areas, migration toward towns became common as people sought food and shelter, increasing pressure on already strained urban centers. As the frost slowly began to break in late February and early March, rivers started to shift and thaw. While this signaled the end of the most brutal cold, it brought new dangers. Enormous blocks of ice, loosened from riverbanks, drifted downstream, destroying bridges, damaging homes, and flooding riverside towns. Communities faced the double challenge of relief from the cold while contending with the destruction left by the thaw. The famous frost fair on the Thames ended abruptly, with stalls dismantled as cracks in the ice became too dangerous to ignore. When spring finally arrived, the thaw revealed the full extent of the devastation. Crops were ruined, livestock populations drastically reduced, and infrastructure damaged across the continent. Famine spread to regions that had previously survived the cold, while trade networks struggled to restore the flow of essential goods. Families who had survived the frost now faced months of scarcity, relying on foraged foods, reduced rations, or aid from local governments and religious institutions. The human toll was staggering. Parish records and local chronicles report elevated mortality, particularly among children, the elderly, and the infirm. Disease spread among weakened populations, exacerbated by hunger and exposure. Communities relied heavily on mutual aid networks and church support to survive, creating stronger bonds among neighbors and reinforcing the social importance of religious and local institutions. Recovery was slow. Agricultural practices changed as farmers adopted hardier grain varieties and improved storage methods. Barns and stables were reinforced to protect animals in future winters. Governments began developing early systems of disaster response, maintaining grain reserves, and learning the importance of infrastructure resilience. Trade adapted to the lessons learned, with merchants exploring alternative routes and methods to ensure the transport of essential goods. Culturally, the winter left an enduring legacy. Stories, songs, and chronicles preserved the memory of the Great Frost, emphasizing human resilience, communal support, and the dangers posed by nature. The winter became a reference point for future generations, a benchmark against which all extreme weather events were measured. Scholars, naturalists, and early meteorologists noted the impact of prolonged cold, studying its effects on crops, livestock, and society, laying the groundwork for future scientific inquiry into climate patterns. Economically, the frost reshaped markets and communities. Shortages created both hardship and opportunity. Firewood sellers, seed suppliers, and surviving merchants gained prominence, while small-scale farmers and those unable to recover their herds faced long-term difficulty. Over time, communities adapted, learning to plan for scarcity, strengthen social bonds, and rebuild livelihoods in the aftermath of disaster. By the end of 1709, Europe had survived one of the harshest winters in memory. Yet the shadow of the Great Frost lingered. The continent had learned lessons about the fragility of society, the importance of preparation, and the resilience required to endure extreme weather. Memories of frozen rivers, lost harvests, and months of hunger remained vivid, passed down through generations as both warning and testament to human endurance. The Great Frost of 1709 was not just a winter of unprecedented cold. It was a turning point, a moment in history where nature's force challenged human survival on a massive scale. It transformed agriculture, governance, social structures, and cultural consciousness. Though the ice melted and life gradually returned to normal, the imprint of that winter would last for decades, shaping how Europe approached the dangers of future winters and the strategies necessary to survive them. Europe emerged with scars, lessons, and stories of courage. Families rebuilt their farms, communities reestablished trade routes, and nations adjusted policies to prevent similar disasters. Yet, the frost remained an enduring symbol of both nature's power and humanity's capacity to endure, reminding all who survived that preparation, cooperation, and resilience were as crucial as warmth and food when facing the coldest winter in history.